Welcome, all you adventurous readers, to the epic worlds of Alfred Döblin, where we explore the life and works of this fascinating but little-known early 20th century writer. Brought to you by the website beyondalexanderplatz.com.
Welcome to Episode 1. My name's Chris Godwin, and I've been translating Döblin for pretty solidly the last 10 years. This first episode will take a quick look at who was Alfred Döblin, why does he matter, what does he offer to adventurous readers in the 21st century. And I'm here with my daughter-in-law, Katie.
Hi everyone. Yes, my name is Katie Kavanagh and I'm actually a primary school teacher. I don't really know anything about Döblin, but I'm very excited to learn. And my role here is to pepper Chris with lots of questions and try and keep him on track a bit. And as we go through the series, if we have questions from listeners as well, we will try and embed them into our episodes.
Yes, indeed. And my goodness me, what a lot of questions there are. Döblin lived through quite a chaotic time, the first half of the 20th century.
I think for all of our, Alfred Döblin is a very niche topic, which is perfect for a podcast. But I imagine that some of our listeners already have a bit of knowledge and have ended up here, but there'll be quite a few who don't know anything about Alfred Döblin. So I think that's a good place for us to start. So why is he significant in the context of German literature and public life, really?
Yes, right.
And I do know that he was German.
Right. Well, where to start? I think from the kind of 30,000-foot view, I think, we can mark Döblin as one of the three most significant figures in German literature of the first half of the 20th century.
Oh, okay. Well, who were the other two?
Okay, well, the other two, first of all, we had Thomas Mann.
I don't know him.
Okay, but Thomas Mann is very well known to the general literate English population.
Okay.
And the other one was Bertolt Brecht.
I have heard of Brecht.
Okay, well, Brecht and Döblin were very good friends. And in fact, Brecht said that Döblin had taught him what he needed to know to develop Brecht's, version of the theatre, which was quite a radical break with the traditional way that dramas were presented.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. But the other big difference between Mann and Döblin is, as I say, Mann was famous, right throughout the time that he was actively writing, whereas Döblin was sort of, moderately famous during the 20s, and then at the end of the 20s published his only worldwide bestseller, which was Berlin Alexanderplatz. That made him world famous. As I say, it was a bestseller, and it totally eclipsed everything that he'd written before then.
Do I gather, as a tone behind what you're saying, that Mann and Döblin had a rivalry?
Mann and Döblin were enormous rivals, virtually all through, all through the period when they were active. And periodically it erupted into a kind of a public row.
Oh, okay.
But, certainly at the same time that Alexanderplatz was published, the German newspapers were trying to prod the Nobel Literature Prize Committee into giving Alfred Döblin the Nobel Prize.
Ooh.
Well, a month or two after the Alexanderplatz was published, they gave the prize to Thomas Mann.
Oh, ouch. Okay, so that must have stung a little then.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So can you explain the scope of Alfred Döblin's work, or are we still talking about who he was?
No, we're still at 30,000 feet.
Okay.
So now we want to sort of zoom in on what is this mass of books and journal articles and so on.
Okay.
There's going to be an awful lot of stuff to talk about. So we're going to have, probably 2 or 3 episodes on his career, his biography, his life. We'll have several episodes on his epic novels, because this is the epic worlds of Alfred Döblin.
Mm-hmm.
And also, of course, without forgetting all the enormous output of the rest of his work, which was not the epic novel.
Okay, well, it's a good place to start then. What was the scope of, or what is the scope of Alfred Döblin's work?
The 9 epic novels are the kind of the Stonehenge pillars of his oeuvre. They are, they're kind of great stone slabs of books, 700, 800, 900 pages, sort of built around a new theory of what fiction should be able to do and what historical fiction should be able to do, breaking away from what he regarded as a moribund tradition in German literature. So anyway, apart from these 9 epic novels, only one of which was published in English during his lifetime, and you can probably guess which one that was.
Alexander Platt?
It was indeed Alexander Platt.
Phew.
All the rest, a couple appeared in English in the 1980s, but one of them in a very mutilated form. And really, it was only when I started to translate the rest of his epics that he's now very recently been available to English readers. More of his work is available, so they can get some kind of perspective on the, on his approach to the epic.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned that he faced both critical acclaim and challenges with book sales. Can you elaborate on how his works were received during his lifetime?
Oh, perhaps you should say a few words about the kind of the state of German literature in the early 20th century. From sort of Napoleonic Wars onwards, there was almost nobody writing in German who sort of broke through to become an internationally famous writer, like the Russians, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, or the French, Flaubert, and so on. I mean, there was Heinrich Heine, who lived most of his life in exile from Germany. There was the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived most of his productive life in exile from Germany. And otherwise, literature being produced inside Germany was very conservative, very backward-looking, you could say. It was not engaging with all the big changes that were happening after the unification of Germany in 1871 under Prussia, which led to a huge kind of industrialization boom and huge flocking of people into the big cities. Most German writers were not paying any attention to this at all. So Döblin was very much engaged with the big city and the kind of the ordinary people, shall we say, rather than just that small section of educated sort of intellectuals who had become public officials, civil servants, university teachers, newspaper editors.
Why do you think that was? Can you tell us about his career?
Yeah, okay. Well, he left school in 1900, which is an easy date to remember. He was actually 22 because his education had been delayed by about 3 years because of a family disaster, which we'll be getting into in a later episode. But with some family support, he managed to enroll in university and studied medicine, while also taking some classes in philosophy. Then during the first decade of the 20th century, he was mixing in Berlin with the sort of avant-garde, which gradually coalesced into what people call the Expressionist movement. He helped to found the leading Expressionist journal called Der Sturm, which published some of his stories and other writings. But then in 1912, during a crisis in his life, which again we'll get into in a later episode, he was stimulated to write this big piece, not just little stories and essays and so on, but write something really big. And he was fixated by stories of the Far East. He'd been reading a lot about, there was a lot being translated from Chinese literature into German in that period, the first decade of the 20th century. And he focused on an episode of a sectarian rebellion in 18th century China. So that became his first major novel, and the one that really made him noticed. It's called The Three Leaps of Wang Lun, which I actually translated more than 30 years ago.
Wow.
And is now in its second edition.
Oh.
And this brought him huge kind of critical acclaim, and he was recognized as a very important writer. And in fact, the Wang Lun book brought him a literary prize.
Mm-hmm. Chris, can I just stop you there for a second? So whilst he is writing, is he still operating as a medical doctor?
Oh, yes.
So during this time.
Interesting question. He's had 2 careers. Yes, he was a medical doctor and he was a writer. And a little later in this podcast, we'll be bringing listeners in on this aspect of his life of 2 souls in a single breast.
Okay.
So then Wang Lun was published during the First World War. And towards the latter half of the First World War, he wrote his next great big epic, which was based on the previous Great War in Europe, the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century, which devastated Germany for over 3 decades. So that was published in 1920. And again, the critics marveled at the kind of techniques he was bringing to the to this new world of epic fiction, but probably not too many ordinary people sort of actually made their way through the whole novel at that time.
Okay.
Anyway, Döblin persevered. He was writing lots of political essays at the time.
Yep.
This time of turmoil in Germany at the end of the First World War. The Kaiser had run away, and there was no government, and the army was furious at having been stabbed in the back by the civilians and having to run away from the Western Front and so on. But Döblin kept on writing. His next big epic, when instead of the 18th century or the 17th century, it looked forward to the 27th century. That was called Mountains, Oceans, Giants. My translation was published in 2022.
That's very forward thinking to go from the time of writing to the 27th century.
Well, this was a thing. I mean, he was trying to get a sense of where life and, let's say, Western civilization, shall we say, where was it heading? With all these technological innovations, the ability to wage ever more horrendous wars, all these things about gender identity, the ecology of the world, and so on. Something right. Well, if we carry on with these trends, what's life going to be like a few hundred years from now? And so he wrote this enormous sort of science fiction novel, which it's really in 2 halves. I mean, so the second half involves melting all the ice on Greenland.
Yeah. I know we're going to be covering that in a later episode. We don't want to go into it too detailed right now. But can you take us up to the Second World War?
Oh, gosh, yes, okay. Well, there was one more, before Alexanderplatz, there was one more epic he published, which was extremely bizarre, because he presented it as a kind of a poem.
Oh, okay.
Right? So this was an epic poem in free verse, which some critics thought was absolutely astonishing and really deserved to be, studied and emulated by other writers. But completely clunked with the public. They said, well, they just had no idea what to do with it.
Okay, and why do you think that was?
Because it was so strange. It was, well, I mean, the content was fascinating. I mean, I loved it. When I was translating it, I'd love to get imagining all the things you could do with this in terms of, sort of videos and ballets.
What was it about?
It was a kind of Indian epic, but with lots of kind of existential philosophy sort of built in.
And this is Manas.
This is Manas, which I translated and was published in 2022. 2022.
2022, not 1922.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Oh, that's good. Okay, and we're going to talk about that as well a bit.
Of course. And then we had all the kerfuffle with Alexanderplatz, all the publicity and the best-selling, and his publisher at last was happy with him because his publisher had met Manas with the retort, "How on earth did you come up with this?" So the publisher was very glad when Alexanderplatz came along.
Oh, that's good. Actually, I think that you could. It's a good segue for me. I had a quote from Thomas Mann in front of me, and it says, "Lots of people pick up his books, but precious few finish them," which not only highlights the rivalry again, but also the complication that a reader might have when they're digging into his work.
Well, I mean,
the layperson.
Thomas Mann can talk. I mean, he wrote this great 800-page book called The Magic Mountain.
Right.
It was full of kind of philosophical and political discussions between the inmates of a TB sanatorium high in the Swiss Alps. And, some people think, oh, this is a marvellous book. It's a wonderful book. It's 800 pages. I mean, I wonder how many ordinary readers have actually picked up this book and read it right through to the end.
Right. Okay, so now I think, what year are we up to now?
No, you asked about, up to the Second World War.
Yes,
so
that's right.
All right, so we're getting into the exile period.
Correct.
So, of course, I mean, just, 2 or 3 years after Alexanderplatz's roaring success, the Nazis took over. And Döblin had to flee for his life. Right, so he managed to.
Where did he flee to, Chris?
Well, he managed to get out of Berlin, and then took the train down south and strolled across the Swiss border.
And then why did he have to flee?
Well, because the Gestapo would have arrested him, and he'd have been killed.
What for?
Being a Jew and being a perversely sort of socialist or critical kind of writer.
Okay, and then I also have a note in front of me to say that the Nazis banned all of his books except for Wallenstein.
Yes.
So why was that? What's Wallenstein about?
Well, so Wallenstein's the 30 Years War.
Okay.
And they probably thought, oh, this is a nice kind of warlike
historical
bit of literature, and people who read it will be ginned up to sort of go off and fight and whatnot. But all the big bonfires the Nazis had in May of 1933, where all the libraries were looted of all the books by Jewish writers or communist writers or people who didn't sympathise with the new glorious Greater Germany and so on. They're all piled onto bonfires and set on fire.
And so
Döblin's books were among these.
How did Döblin navigate this period then?
Right. Well, he went off to Switzerland, and he had the first few chapters of his next epic novel in his portmanteau as he strolled across the border. And he said he was actually relieved because the atmosphere in Berlin in the early 1930s was becoming absolutely impossible. The extremists were dominating all the debates, and there were street battles between the left and the right, and sane voices were just being drowned out. So the tension was getting unbearable. So he released the tension by finishing off his next epic novel, which is a very kind of picaresque, burlesque, semi-light-hearted but also serious romp through 1920s Europe by a fallen Babylonian god.
Oh. Again, very different. Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah. So he and his family eventually relocated to Paris.
Okay.
And in 1936, the family became naturalized French because, of course, they no longer had German nationality.
Yeah.
Because, like all the other exiles, the Germans just cancelled their passports and their identities.
And how long did he stay in France for?
Well, until the Germans invaded in 1940.
Okay.
After the declaration of war, he was taken on by the French Ministry of, I forget what the ministry was called, Ministry of Propaganda, let's say, and was helping to write sort of war propaganda for, trying to dishearten the Germans and give encouragement to the French and so on. Didn't sort of get very far. But then when the Germans actually invaded in the spring of 1940, he had to flee from Paris along with all the other officials and so on, and had a very harrowing time, which we'll go into in a later episode, and eventually managed to make his way to Lisbon after all sorts of really sort of frightening things about visas and money for tickets and permits to enter and so on. Really, he was in his 60s by this time.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, made it to New York. And then across the continent to Los Angeles, where there was quite a large community of German exiles from the literary world, philosophy, music, theatre, film, and so on. They were sort of gathering around in Los Angeles. And like some other writers, Döblin was taken on for a year by MGM. It was just a sort of a make-work thing to help him get settled. And the Louis Mayer didn't actually believe he was going to get anything useful for the film, his film productions out of this. But Döblin did actually contribute to some films. In fact, one episode he wrote for a film which won several Oscars that year was actually cut. And so he didn't get an Oscar for being one of the writers on this film.
Oh, no.
Oh, such a narrow escape.
So close.
Yeah. But again, he, in this rather, milieu of Los Angeles where, his English was not very good.
Mm-hmm.
He was trying to get American publishers into doing translations of some of his previous works and couldn't gin up any interest from them, and was beavering away on what turned out to be his longest epic work, which was about the end of the First World War and the collapse in Germany in autumn of 1918 and the spring of 1919. And that turned out to be 2,200 pages in the current 4-volume format.
Wow. And what's the name of that one?
November 1918.
Okay.
That was published in English in the 1980s, but in a very mutilated form because it left out the first volume entirely.
Oh, and I know that you have interest in the first volume.
I've translated the first volume.
Okay.
And this in fact is a problem that's beset Döblin all through his career. That the things have been cut and edited and whatnot. They may not have been exactly what he had intended. From when he was writing his manuscripts.
I'm just going to stop you there, actually. So that's a good point. You talk about in translating. Obviously, the English language has so many different nuances, and so when you are translating, are there different phrases and different ways you can interpret what he's written down? Have you ever had to do any edits to your own translations?
Oh, constantly. As you go through, you're always editing and you're trying to make sure you've got the tone right.
Mm-hmm.
That the word you've selected to represent this sort of German word is actually, really fits this. To somebody seeing it in English for the first time would not know that it was a translation. And this I think is the ideal to aim for, that the text should read as if it had been composed in the language that it's been translated into. Yeah,
so you've got to be really on your game when you're things then.
The amount of labour involved in looking things. Well, I mean, when I translated Wang Lun, the first epic, of course I only had paper materials to deal with because we didn't really have internet in those days. So, my German dictionary almost fell apart at the time. There's so laborious looking things up in there, compared with now. So, it's been so much faster these last 10 years.
Yeah,
just instantly check on Wikipedia or, online dictionaries and so on. It's much faster.
So we've covered up to getting to, so we're in LA now, in Los Angeles in America.
That's right, till the end of the war, really.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And then what happened at the end of the war? Did he go back to, when it was safe, did he go back to Germany? Or
yes, he did, but it was not a happy experience because being now a French citizen and having previously worked in, on one of the war ministry or whatever it was that was producing the propaganda, he was taken on by the French occupation authority in the southwest of Germany. It was occupied by the four powers at the end of the war. So the French had the southwestern part, around Strasbourg, let's say, or across the Rhine from Strasbourg.
Yeah.
So he was taken on by them to be a cultural officer. And, of course, he turned up in a French officer's uniform. And, of course, the Germans he tried to sort of talk to and discuss things with, were very put off by this. So he had a very lonely winter in 1945 on his own. The family hadn't joined him at all. Stuck in Baden, in Württemberg, with the empty shops, nothing in the bookshops, not very much to eat, yeah, so that was quite hard. I mean, gradually, he founded a new cultural journal while he was there, which ran for about 5 years. He managed to interest occasional publishers in bringing out some of his, stuff from the pre-exile period. But they appeared in a very kind of spotty fashion, one of his trilogies, the trilogy which I translated and was published in 2023 as The Land Without Death.
Okay.
This was trilogy, right? 3 items, but they were published a kind of year apart in different colour covers and so on, so nobody knew that they were connected.
Right. And so now we're in the 1950s.
1950s, his health was failing. I mean, he was still, for his 70th birthday, for example, friends and colleagues organised, events and what the Germans call a Festschrift.
And that was 1948.
You know what a Festschrift is?
I don't know. Festival.
Yeah. No. It's a.
I don't know.
It's a festive volume of people writing or contributing essays or congratulatory notes or something to some eminent person.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So he hadn't been forgotten.
He hadn't been forgotten. No. So in 1948 he had this Festschrift for his 70th birthday.
Okay.
The East Germans were very keen to sort of get him to sort of come over to East Berlin and help with the cultural revival in the East, but he'd converted to Roman Catholic while he was in Los Angeles, and I think he was a bit suspicious of the East German regime, which,
right.
Well, I mean, East Germany was very Lutheran, right? Protestant Lutheran. Anyway, he didn't go to the East.
And then he died, so his health declined in the 1950s and he died in 1957.
That's right. Yeah. And we could mention, during the German invasion in 1940, it had been a condition of the family being given French citizenship that his 2 then teenage sons, upper teenage sons, should enroll in the military when the call came.
Right.
And one of these sons, Wolfgang, who it turns out was a genius of a mathematician, died during the French invasion in the spring of 1940. And his parents knew nothing. They just, lost touch with him. They hadn't any idea what had happened to him. So they discovered after going back to Paris in 1945 that what had really happened to him, they managed to find out where he was buried, which was a little village churchyard in the Vosges hills in east of France. So Alfred then was buried alongside Wolfgang in this little churchyard.
Okay.
And then his wife Erna took her own life a few months later.
Oh, that's sad.
It's very sad. And she was then laid beside Alfred.
I'm assuming she was so full of grief.
It was a very curious marriage. I mean, it was a very stormy marriage, but and we'll get into this later. The sins of the fathers thing comes into it, because Döblin remained loyally the husband of Erna right to the end, even though they were actually very ill-suited to each other.
Right.
But the story of why he did that, then we can cover
we'll talk
later
about later.
episode.
Okay, and they were buried in the same churchyard?
In the same churchyard beside Wolfgang.
Okay. Yeah. And you said he had 2 children?
No, he had 4 sons.
Oh, 4 sons, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
and are all of them buried together? Or?
No, I don't think so. Yes, no, I mean, Klaus, Wolfgang's brother, also, had quite a harrowing time. He stayed behind in France and then had to eventually flee to Switzerland and spend several war years in Switzerland, but at least he was found safe and sound at the end. And then Stefan, the youngest, accompanied them to Los Angeles to finish his schooling.
Okay.
And then I think at the end of the war, he was enrolled he was called up into the American Army. But anyway, yeah, I mean, Stefan's son, Francis, actually got in touch with me earlier this year to see how we could, collaborate on sort of making Döblin's work better known in English. So, that was a very nice little surprise. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so I think we've got to the end of his life, so that concludes that. And it would be good. I know that you have put together, Chris, you brought a piece of an essay called Two Souls in a Single Breast.
Yes, this was... I mean, in the 1920s, newspapers were always sort of hungry for words to fill up their pages, and they kept circulating little questionnaires to various sort of public figures in the hope that answers to these questionnaires would, give them a column or two
Okay,
to fill up.
This was written in 1928.
1928.
At the height of his popularity, the height of his fame.
Well, it was just before Berlin Alexander was
not
published.
Quite then.
No, but this was his 50th anniversary year.
He was on the up.
He was on the up. There was lots of celebrations in the newspapers of this great writer, with his, the epics he's published before, and all his literature, his theories about literature and his political essays and so on. But a particular newspaper called the Berliner Volkszeitung, the Berlin People's Paper, in April 1928, they must have got this idea of getting two public figures to interview each other and then give, they'd be able to print the views. But here, Döblin thought, oh, right, he's been having this dual career of doctor and writer all along, so here we've got two people already.
I love this. I think it's so clever. And it's just the way that they're so different. So the first extract is as Dr. Döblin, the neurologist, and he's talking about Döblin, the writer.
Yeah, and I think you should read this first bit, and then I'll read the second bit.
Ooh, okay, great. I need to put a academic head on as a neurologist, I feel. Okay. As a doctor, I'm only vaguely aware of the writer of the same name. To tell the truth, I don't know him at all. I work in the East End of Berlin in a medium-sized medical practice. Really, not a big one at all. I am a neurologist, and this activity takes up virtually my whole day. I have no great leanings toward literature, find books quite boring, and as for books by the man who, you tell me, bears the same name as me, I have sometimes come across them by chance at the homes of acquaintances, but dipping into them I was left completely cold and uninterested. This gentleman seems to have a good imagination, but I cannot follow him down that road. On my income, I cannot afford trips to China and India, so I have no way to check up on what he writes. And anyway, for this kind of thing, I prefer original reports, i.e. first-person travelogues, of which I am a keen reader. And another thing, I cannot get to grips at all with the style of this man, the author who bears the same name as me. It is just too difficult. Why should anyone tired out after a hard day's work be asked to wade through such stuff of his own accord? And allow me, please, a general remark, which may come across as a bit political or ethical. More so than his books, I am familiar with this writer's occasional effusions as delivered to me by the newspaper, which of course I read. I must confess I cannot make head or tail of the man, from a political angle or in general. My appetite for knowing him better is not in the least improved by this effusions. Sometimes he seems to stand squarely on the left, even the extreme left, maybe left squared, and then he says something that is either not thought through, which is unacceptable in a man of his years, or makes out that he is above the party's absurd, authorial arrogance. In short, it was you, editor, who asked for my opinion of this writer, the man with the red nose. The coincidence of names led you to do so. I myself would never have bothered with him, any more than with any other young author, and I say again, the gentleman is almost a complete stranger to me. He is of no interest to me. I am not related to him by blood or marriage, and I could not care less about his verdict on me, which you tell me you are soliciting from him. Whatever apparently mischievous assertions he may cast will not touch me.
Wow, there's quite a lot there that we'll be going into in later episodes. But let's see how the writer now confronts this strange neurologist, right?
Okay,
the writer
so you are now in role.
I am in role, right? The writer Döblin and the neurologist Döblin.
Here we go.
Even though it is Easter, and as you can imagine, I'm buried under piles of work and questionnaires and so on, I'm most grateful to you, editor, for setting me this remarkable task and in a certain sense enriching my circle of acquaintances. I'm currently working on a Berlin novel. I mean an epic work in everyday language, the action of which takes place in the East End of Berlin, around Alexanderplatz and the Rosenthaler Gate. So your request for my comments on the neurologist of the same name was an interesting lead. Maybe it can be another source of material, I thought, along with the Salvation Army, the slaughterhouse, and the criminal dossiers. So I went over there, and now I report back. The man is sprightly and makes not too bad an impression. I attended his clinic and sat in his waiting room. A waiting room is the most remarkable milieu you can imagine. And when I introduced myself to the gentleman and we had a good laugh about the coincidence, God knows our origins could not be more different, he told me lots of things which, with his permission, I noted down there and then. These general practitioners are not to be envied. I saw the peculiarly stressful work that kept him busy, and this mostly with the strangest kind of patients. I'm sure that he's no untypical example of this specialism, but the very fact of his toiling here anonymously did endear him to me. He's my exact opposite, I realized as he busied himself with practical tasks and spoke and observed. I, the perpetual solo dancer, or prima donna, as my publisher once called me. He, a grey soldier in a silent army. I am sure I made no great impression on my namesake. Sometimes I grew rather nervous when he gazed at me in a psychotherapeutic kind of way. I have a few defects in that area, complexes probably, and his experienced nose no doubt sniffed them out. Please do not be angry when I confess that for this reason I did not pursue any deeper acquaintance with him. To tell the truth, I did not feel very comfortable sitting across from him. Too many unpleasantnesses come to mind in such a situation. But I retain a good memory of the small, slender man with the doctor's pince-nez, and I would be delighted to know, if you can betray the secret, what this anonymous man had to say about me, whom he certainly saw not as a writer, but merely as a human being.
NC.
Well, what do you think of that, Katie?
I really enjoyed that. I think that's great because they're so different. And you can, that really comes across in the writing as well. You can see he's much more relaxed as in role as the writer himself, and seems a bit more detached in role as the neurologist. They're so completely different.
Yeah, but I mean, the neurologist is speaking as the kind of the man in the street.
Yeah.
Isn't he? Well, all these arty-farty books, he's got the time to read that.
That's it. Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah. But, I mean, some of the things, I mean, the two souls in one breast aspect actually comes through very clearly in the way that he described how he would set about writing one of his epic novels. And we'll be going into this in more detail in a later episode. But he really was writing in a kind of a trance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the philosopher Günther Anders, who met Döblin during this period, actually said it was as he wrote as if he was hypnotized, and produced creations which were greater than the creator.
Now, I did write something down earlier. Now, what was it? In something you sent me, Chris. Quoted from him that he recognised that for him to start writing, there must have been a seed, a spark, and that it unravelled like a ball of string from the beginning to the end. So he implied also that he was relieved when it was finished.
Well, once he'd finished a book, he just sort of put it aside. He really, he hardly even read the printed page proofs.
They are big books as well.
Yes,
in the main.
Yeah, no, they were. And I mean, early on, he had described his juvenile writings, he said he felt towards these writings like a man with a cold feels about his sniffles. In other words, it's just
can't wait to get rid of
stuff to be got out and thrown in the bin. This kind.
I wonder how this compares to other authors as well. I mean,
Interesting question. Yeah.
Some of them, I guess, would feel similar, but others, like their baby.
Yeah.
But I mean,
this procedure did impart a very kind of special tinge to Döblin's writings, which are generally, they're very recognizable, but there is nothing kind of artificially sort of, clever dick kind of moldings to show how clever I am in such a, it all comes across as very real.
Okay.
Right? And this is a thing that people comment on Döblin's writings generally, that he presents things that are very real to you, even when he's talking about extremely kind of culturally distant sort of things. You can really feel this is the world.
Okay. So Chris, if the listeners would like to find out a little bit more, can you tell us about where they can go to?
Yes, of course, the website.
What's your name? The name
beyond-alexanderplatz.com.
And we'll be putting that link in the show notes.
Yes. So the idea was that this would be beyond Alexanderplatz because everybody knows about Berlin Alexanderplatz already. The website has got a lot of stuff about Alfred Döblin's life and career, and as well as PDFs of those as yet unpublished translations. So do go and pay a visit.
We should also say that each episode will have a similar frame around it. So we will start by introducing a theme or something about Alfred Döblin and that connects to one of the themes that he's written about.
Yeah.
And then we will be reading an excerpt from one of his...
his writings, yes, which will help to stimulate the readers to go and look more deeply into the into the works.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you so much, Chris. It's been a fun episode.
Well, thank you so much, Katie, for setting it up.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Epic Worlds of Alfred Döblin. Join us next time to explore more about this fascinating writer's life and works. Meanwhile, visit the website beyond-alexanderplatz.com for posts about Döblin and some of his unjustly neglected contemporaries, as well as downloads of translations. So until next time, happy reading.